I'm going to start this overview with the same story that I start the book with, which is the story of Ethel Mckenzie. So Ethel Mckenzie was born in 1885 in San Francisco. And in her 20s, she caught what she called suffrage fever. And she helped to fight for the right of women to vote in California. And in fact, the women in California won that right 9 years before the rest of the nation obtained the right to vote in the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. But then when she herself went to cast her vote, the registrar in San Francisco said, you cannot vote because you are not a US citizen. And the reason was that she'd married a non-citizen a few years before. And under a federal law in place at the time and in place for several decades, all American women, and only women who married non-citizens, automatically lost their right to vote. So being a red-blooded American, Ethel Mckenzie filed a lawsuit, and she took it all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And I tell her story in my book, You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers. And so the story is a history of citizenship stripping in the United States. There's been some terrific scholarship on pieces of that history, but I wanted to tell it as a whole. I wanted to tell the whole story. And in fact, as I started this book, I thought, well, this is an important topic, and I'm convinced of that. But I didn't think, as I started the research, that it actually affected enormous numbers of people. I thought tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. But it turns out to be millions, and that shocked me. And it turns out the United States has taken the lead in citizenship stripping in much of the world. So this story is important for me now on many respects, in many regards. There's two themes to the book that run throughout the book. First is that the government used citizenship stripping to take away legal rights and privileges that come with citizenship, such as the right to vote, to hold office, and most important, especially today, the right to enter and remain in the United States. And they did this to deprive disfavored groups and individuals of these rights. And they also used citizenship stripping as a proxy for taking away rights that had once been taken away on other grounds. So of course, when we started as a nation, it was only white male property owners who could vote. Citizenship didn't come into it. And today, and in the more recent past, the government has used citizenship stripping as a way to deprive these disfavored groups of these rights that they no longer could explicitly take away on those protected grounds. So that's one theme of the book. Another theme of the book is that while I'm very interested, of course, in the legal rights of citizenship, citizenship is more than that. It's also about identity and belonging. And citizenship stripping has been used to deprive individuals of their identity as American citizens. They're literally being told by their government, you are not American. And the significance is felt not only by them, but also by the rest of us, those who remain behind, because the government is just as much trying to tell us who we are as Americans when it expels others from membership in this group. So those are the two themes. And I tell the story from the bottom up. And methodologically, I decided I wanted to tell it as a narrative nonfiction book. I mean it to be accessible to more mainstream readers, although I hope it's of interest to academics as well. And I tell the story through 9 individuals, and I did a deep dive into the archive to find as much as possible their experience as told through their words. And I quote them throughout the book in their letters and their testimony and their oral histories, because I wanted you to see what they went through from their perspective, even though they very much represent much larger groups of people. So I start the book with Dred Scott, of course, the infamous case about slavery, but also about citizenship. And Chief Justice Taney in that case said that no Black person, slave or free, was a citizen of the United States. That case, of course, helped to bring about the Civil War. But what fascinated me was that in 1865, there was 2 groups of people who were not citizens of the United States, and their future was uncertain in this country. One group was the 4.5 newly freed slaves, and the other group, which I think we forget about, is the Confederate leaders, who had expatriated themselves. They had lost their citizenship for the very good reason of they said they were their own country, a country premised on slavery. And the Reconstruction Congress knew that it had on its hands a race for citizenship, because if it granted back citizenship rights to these Confederate leaders before the newly freed slaves got their citizenship, then they knew what would happen, which is that the newly freed slaves would have no chance of political power. So the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, the first sentence, gives citizenship to all born on US soil. It's an anti-caste provision, and it's meant to create equality among citizens, as is the Equal Protection Clause in that same section. But many forget about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which barred the Confederate leaders from holding office in state or federal government. And I tell the story in the book of Hiram Rhodes Rebels, who's the first African-American elected to Congress. He should be a household name, but he is certainly not. And in 1870, he's elected. But for several days on the floor of the Senate, he had to fight to be seated because some members of the Senate claimed he was not a citizen, despite the language of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. So he prevails, he takes office, and in great symbolic importance, it's the same seat that once was held by Jefferson Davis, a former leader of the Confederacy, and a time when Davis was not allowed to serve in office, thanks to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But of course, we know how this story ends, sadly, which is that Reconstruction briefly did provide an avenue to power, political power, to the newly freed slaves. But at the end of the day, the federal government abandoned that project. And in fact, as I describe in the book, in 1976, in my own lifetime, the Congress of the United States voted nearly unanimously to give citizenship rights back to Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. It was obviously purely symbolic, but it was importantly symbolic. And I think it really shows us how far the country still had to go, even at that late date, when it comes to recognizing full citizenship rights of those who had lost them during that period. So then I move forward in history. I talk about Wong Kim Ark, who is the plaintiff in the Supreme Court case. He was born in the United States, and yet the government claimed you are not an American, you are not a citizen, despite your birth in the United States after the 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship. So he prevailed, and yet he continued to struggle. And my dive into the archives showed me that even after he won as the named plaintiff in the Supreme Court case establishing birthright citizenship, he was arrested yet again and nearly deported yet again because the government didn't believe he was a citizen. I, of course, talk about the women who were expatriated and their fight to get their citizenship rights back, which is a fascinating aspect of the story to me. I also talk about labor leaders who were naturalized citizens who lost their citizenship because the government didn't like what they were saying, essentially. Finally, the mass deportations of Mexican and Mexican Americans in the 1930s and the 1950s are yet another example. And while these stories are grim, I take heart from the fact that people fought, and often successfully, to get their citizenship back. The final chapter brings us to the present day. I wrote it during the Trump administration, it kept getting longer. And I described the massive denaturalization campaign under that administration, as well as the effort to take away citizenship or the threat to take away citizenship from the children of undocumented immigrants. And so that last chapter shows us that citizenship stripping continues to this day. So I'll conclude here by pointing out something I'm sure everyone is familiar with, which was that when Barack Obama took office, there was this baseless and I thought ridiculous claim that he was not a US citizen eligible to serve as president. I paid it no mind. I thought it was sort of a fringe argument. Of course, Trump took it up and made it more visible to the public eye, but I still thought of it as laughable. But I was looking at a New York Times poll from 2016, 8 years after Obama had been president, or 8 years, at the end of his 8 years as president. And a majority of the people polled, not just Republicans, just a cross-section of America, said they questioned whether Barack Obama was a citizen of the United States. And that showed me that Hiram Rhodes rebels who had to fight for his eligibility as a citizen of the United States to serve in 1870, that fight is ongoing today.